Hello and welcome back to another episode of Straightforward Tanks, the series in which I show you how you can paint your tanks without having to use an airbrush, specialist paints or weathering powders. In this video I'll be showing you how you can paint your tanks using the British European Camo scheme, and I'll be using a Warlord Games Cromwell to do so. And as with the previous videos in this series, I'll be using the Army Painter's range of aerosol paints and war paints to paint this miniature. Here we have the Cromwell that's been primed using the Army Painter's Angel Green Spray Primer. Now the first step in painting this miniature is to apply a dry brush across the entirety of the armour, and for this we'll be using Army Green. For this step we're using our vehicle and monster brush, and this is because it's the largest brush out of the Army Painter range, and it gives us some excellent quick coverage over the areas. And you can see here I'm just going to be focusing the brush over the edges, and it picks out all of the raised details, as you can see here. Once your dry brushing is complete, you should have something like this. So you can see that we've got all of the edges have been picked out the lighter colour, and it creates some nice highlights on the surfaces there. Now the next step is to apply some shading into the recesses and overall darken the colour of the overall tank, and for this we'll be using green tone ink. For this wash I'm using my large dry brush, as it gives me a good amount of control but also some quick coverage over the large surfaces. And I've also mixed in around about 50% water into the ink. Now this is because it prevents streaks as you're washing it across the surface. You can just see here it pools nicely in the recesses and also slightly darkens the green back to a darker green again. Once the wash dries, you can see that it blends in quite nicely the highlight and the base coat, and also creates some nice shading in the recesses. Now the next step is to paint the tracks at the bottom there, and for this we'll be using Monster Brown. Now for this step I'm using my monster brush, and this is because it will give me some good control over painting the tracks in these harder to reach areas, but it's also allow me to paint quickly the larger flat areas such as this part here. Now I've mixed in roughly 30% water into the mix here just to improve the flow, and once I've done one coat I'll be going over again with the second coat. Once you've finished painting the tracks, the next step is to paint the rubber lining around the road wheels. We're painting any extra equipment on the top as well, such as the spade and any tow cables that may be dotted about the miniature, and including the machine gun in the turret there, and also on the front hull there as well. I'm painting all of these areas with matte black. For this particular step I'm using my regiment brush, and this will allow me to have some good control as I pick out the lining around the edge of the wheels, just like so. Just painting them very carefully with the black. Now once you've completed your road wheels, tracks and also any other equipment on the surface of the miniature, you can now start to apply any transfers that you want to do so, and we'll be applying those before we move on to the weathering stage. Once you've applied the transfers, we can now start working on the weathering. Now the first stage is to apply some grime and dirt into the recesses of the armour and also into the tracks as well, and for this we'll be using strong tone ink. This time around I'm using my regiment brush for this wash, just because it gives me some good control over the areas. However, when you come to wash over the tracks and the larger areas, I would recommend maybe using a small or large dry brush. So with this I'm just going to be running it into the seams like so, just to create the effect that mud has accumulated into the recesses and then dried. We don't want to be applying it everywhere, but it really is up to you how much you apply. Generally a good idea to apply it around recesses and grooves like I'm doing so here. The next step is to apply some mud to the tank, and for this we'll be using Monster Brown, and we're focusing this around the tracks and also around the bottom here, basically anywhere where the mud would appear. For this step I'm using my small dry brush here, and I've removed most of the paint off the brush. It's only a small amount. I'm just going to be using this kind of dragging effect that I'm using here just along the tracks, just at the bottom, to simulate that mud's been flicked up off the tracks as the tank's been driving along and then dried. I'll be applying this technique across the miniature. Once you've completed the mud effects on the Cromwell, the next step is to apply some chipping to the armour. And for this we'll be using a 50-50 mix of matte black and uniform grey. For this step, instead of using a normal brush, I'll be back using my foam here. This is just the packaging foam that you get in a lot of miniature blisters. And I'm just going to be dabbing this onto the corners of the Cromwell, just on the turret here for example. And this will create a nice chipped metal effect just on the corner there. You can see that it's as if the paint's been worn off and it's gone down to the primer. We can just apply this to anywhere on the miniature where we would expect this kind of damage to occur. And here we have the completed miniature. Now, whilst I've used a Cromwell for this particular tutorial, you could just as easily apply it to any of the other British vehicles if you want to apply that same European camo scheme. Now, if you enjoyed this tutorial and would like to see more, do let me know which camo schemes you would like me to cover in future videos. Additionally, if you want to support me in making more tutorials, you can do so by heading over to my Patreon page, where you can donate to me from as little as $1 a month. So, until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.